Greetings from New York City and heartiest congratulations for 10 successful years of delivering an extraordinary service, the National LGBT Helpline. I want to thank especially the volunteers who have given of their time, their love, and their commitment to offering that listening ear, and especially during these pandemic times when we have so many people whose sense of loneliness has increased because of the isolation. So well done, congratulations, and have great celebrations for the extraordinary contribution that you have offered to our people.
A big, huge, massive congratulations to everybody at the National LGBT Helpline. It's your 10th anniversary, and what an incredible achievement. I think it's amazing the amount of work that the volunteers have done there over the last 10 years, with the support and advice for people who are ringing up the helpline, and also the services that they offer to so many organisations. Amazing also that the helpline continued on during COVID, and there was always somebody at the end of the line for somebody who needed to reach out. So congratulations to everybody there at your 10th anniversary.
Lovely. So from Catherine Zappone and Anna Nolan, well done everybody, and let's keep going for another 10 years, and let's keep going with our conference. And Stephen O'Riordan, roll it there.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Stephen, and I'm the Services Development Coordinator, and I'm in the office here in Dublin at LGBT Ireland. So this section of the panel, we're going to be talking with Paul from Focus Ireland and Joanne from a Chrysalis community project in relation to homelessness and addiction. So Paul Kelly is the representative from Focus Ireland, and when we were preparing for this, just this week, I was looking at some of the information on, up-to-date information on homelessness. So we have 8,702 adults and children living in emergency accommodation in Ireland this week, today. Last year, it was 10,388 this time last year. So Focus Ireland this week published their 2019 annual report. And obviously, as we all know, it makes for very stark reading when we hear about homelessness in Ireland, which has been an epidemic in Ireland for many, many years. So Paul is going to talk to us today, and Joanne, around some of the things that they face in the services that they provide and how that might relate to affecting LGBT people in Ireland today. And so Paul and Joanne, you're very welcome. So you're very welcome.
Thank you.
So Paul, you're working for Focus Ireland. I previously have worked for Focus Ireland, and I've interacted with you on a few trainings. You've trained me on a few occasions, so it's lovely to see you. And I've referred to the Chrysalis Community Drug Project on a few occasions, Joanne. So it's such a small community, really, when you think about it.
It really is.
We'd really love to hear about sort of the knowledge and level of support that you provide to people who are experiencing homelessness and addiction. And then we might talk about the specific needs of LGBT plus people. So maybe you'd like to start us off perhaps by giving us an introduction on who you are and where you are in the country today.
My name is Joanne. I'm an addiction case manager at Chrysalis Community Drug Project. I've been working for Chrysalis now for 14 months, and I previously worked for them 10 years ago for 3 years also. I've worked in many different services, cross care, I've worked in homelessness, I've worked for Dublin Simon outreach team, I've worked for Advance and Ballyferma. Yeah, that's kind of me.
Great, thank you, Joanne. Paul, you'd like to introduce yourself?
How are you doing? My name is Paul Kelly. I am a Youth Services Manager for Focus Ireland. I've been managing services there for just gone 20 years there on the 1st of August this year. And I've managed everything bar the coffee shop in Focus Ireland at this stage. Specifically in relation to LGBTI, only last week, Focus Ireland launched the first ever study of homelessness and LGBTI in Ireland. It's a qualitative study because there's no statistics, which probably doesn't come as a surprise to many. So it's just useful that there is a paucity of research around this area. The one thing I don't want to do today is give you a load of stats. But I think in fairness, Stephen did give one there of 8,700. But what's interesting is Manchester is the same size as Ireland, and their homeless population is 5,600. So it's very interesting. It's like apples and oranges, but it's just in terms of population sizes, it's worth noting. Also, they've only one MP, and we have got an Oireachtas and a Shannon and what not. Everyone in the we've got a parish rep nearly in the Shannon.
So obviously the whole area of homelessness and addiction is as much a political issue as it is a societal and systemic issue. Look, the Focus Ireland report that was published, the first ever report on LGBTI plus young people's experiences of homelessness. It's a 128-page reading. There's
an executive summary.
Executive summary, thank God for those.
Yeah.
So that's definitely worth that. But I suppose one piece that I saw in that was around how homelessness affects LGBT people, which I thought was striking. So if you were one of those 10,000 families living in emergency accommodation, perhaps in a hotel room, sharing the room with your teenage children and younger children, all of you packed in together, it's already quite a stressful experience. One of the quotes from that report was talking around living in emergency accommodation in hotels and family hubs, and that young people are trying to come out to meet those developmental milestones that we all meet, but doing that in very confined spaces, and not having that experience of moving out of home and moving on to college. COVID aside, can you give us a sense of the people that you work with, that you've encountered who are LGBT young people?
Probably we need to take a step back there first, Stephen, in terms of to put a little bit of context on becoming homeless. Because you become homeless, you experience homeless, and then you leave homelessness. And hopefully everybody leaves homelessness. And it's probably, for everybody who's here today, and thank you for asking me to be part of this, I just want you to image in your mind's eye what you understand as a homeless person. Quite quickly, I would say there's a number of elephants in the room, that it's somebody in a sleeping bag, somebody who is tapping on, if you're in Dublin, it's on O'Connell Bridge or in shop fronts, things like that. That's a very small percentage of homelessness. Because if you take the statistic that Stephen's given of 8,700, there ain't nearly 10,000 people tapping on O'Connell Bridge in Dublin. But when you do see someone tapping, do think about what does it take to have been stripped from you, to actually have to sit down and put your hand out. Forget the cause or the relationship to drugs, and Joanne will talk about this, but just think about the level of self-esteem that must have been just stripped from you to actually put your hand out to another human being with a cup from Starbucks or wherever. But it's just useful to note that. What's very important to realize is there's 4 basic types of homelessness, or causes, sorry, of homelessness. The first one's structural, and that's basically when you look at things like affordability of accommodation. So someone who's on, say, a clerical officer in the public service, for example, who's on a minimal salary, living in Dublin, been charged $2,000 a month for accommodation. If the landlord pops that accommodation, the rent up on that accommodation, as is his or her want, maybe another 500 quid, because we live in a capitalist society, they probably can't afford that accommodation. So there's a structural reason why they go into homelessness. Then you also have economic reasons, which are more related to poverty. And you've got the American system, which is no welfare, and then you have our system, which some have referred to as a nanny state. But the biggest one is probably personal. If we go straight into LGBTI, a personal coming out, you think about how someone who has identity or sexuality issues, first person they have to come out to them is themselves, but fundamentally they'll also come out then to their family and things like that. And regardless, like the Fundamental Rights Agency last year, I think they only published this year their stats for the country research in Ireland, we still have very high levels of homophobia and transphobia. So we might look great on paper, and I don't need to tell people on the helpline that there is high levels still of homophobia and transphobia in the country. So one of the things we noticed, for example, particularly in young people, when the day of the referendum and we brought in marriage equality, that Monday, I noticed in one of my youth services, a very large increase in young country males and females. I put it down to, I actually didn't know what to put it down to. And then about 2 or 3 days later, I was kind of thinking, what is going on here? And literally they had the courage to come out, but then their families put them out. So it's on the surface, we look good, but underneath, when you scratch, we're still not great.
Yes.
So fundamentally, if someone was asked, what is the reason for your homelessness there? It would have been family breakdown. Mm. Whereas actually, nobody asked, well, actually, what was the cause of the family breakdown? And it was the coming out process. Within that then, if they come into emergency accommodation, and I do manage emergency accommodation for under 18s. Yeah, thanks, Stephen. So just so as people are aware, these are the 4 that research has shown us, the structural ones that I was talking about, good quality accommodation. Institutional, specifically in Ireland, young people leaving care. It is a national or it is an international feature as well, but Ireland appears to have a very high population of young people leaving the foster care system. We're also unique in Europe that 96% of the children, or 94% of the children we have in care is actually in foster caring, which is good, and not large institutions or smaller institutions of residential units. Prison and also mental health facilities. There's been very little research done on prisons in Ireland on LGBTI. A friend of mine is a director of a service that works with prisoners, and she also has started to notice this, so she's hoping to commission some research. Relationship causes and the personal causes. So these really do come into the realm of the interpersonal and abusive relationships within. We do not give enough credence in the community to intimate partner violence or domestic violence and what happens there. And you will probably see that quite regularly or hear about it on the phones. And the family breakdown, which very much is related to us, it's very much around coming out and family rejection. And then the personal causes, in terms of the homeless population, and these are general, the homeless population is overrepresented with mental health, people with learning disabilities or learning difficulties, and problem drink and alcohol use. Particularly when it comes to problem drink and alcohol use, it is not always the cause, but it certainly is a survival mechanism. And I've often said to myself, if I was on the boardwalk, I would probably be drinking and taking drugs. So, and the thing here around the personal causes, they are risk factors. So they are not necessarily the primary avenue in, but they certainly will predispose anybody to it. And people don't give enough credence to the ability to pay mortgages and rent, etc. And certainly in the economic the crash that happened 10 years ago, economic homelessness has skyrocketed in Ireland. Almost 80% of people coming into homelessness at that point were for economic reasons. And where you tend to see that is with families and migrants who have come into Ireland to work in the economy because there wasn't enough workers, and they tend to be the first that will fall into the homelessness. Can you fire it on there? This is also very important to know. Ireland has poor definitions legally of homelessness. So the main thing was the 1953 Act, which only entitles you to shelter. That is not defined. And the traditional definition of that was anybody who lives outside of Dublin. It was called the county home. So I'm sure anybody who's from the countryside, every main town would have had the county home, which people traditionally called the nursing home, run by the HSE. That was the only legislative remit or protection for homeless people in Ireland. Then the Housing Act came in 1988 and defined homelessness for the first time. That is the primary legislation still to this day. And the Childcare Act literally puts, there's a section of the Childcare Act that if a young person under 18 becomes homeless, TUSLA must respond. How they respond is a different kettle of fish.
Mm.
And all the Housing Act does is it basically just says you cannot be reasonably expected to live where you're currently, if the accommodation is poor, or, the main thing here is it's in the opinion of the local authority. So one person could decide you're homeless and the other person might decide you're not homeless if you have options. So just, I thought it was just important to note that, because at the end of the day, it is the local authority or the council. They must accept you as homeless. If they don't accept you as homeless, you will not get any statutory services. You'll get the voluntary sector, but you won't get access to things like emergency accommodation. And also in Ireland, there's no right to housing. There's no constitutional right. There is a move afoot to try and get that into the constitution.
And of course, Paul, you know, sort of apart from sort of, you know, registering as homeless and having that be acceptable to the local accountability authority, we also have a huge portion of the population in those 10,000 statistics that I mentioned earlier who are actually not identified as homelessness because they may be couch surfing, they may be living with an aunt, a friend, they may have come out recently and are staying with their sister. So those people are not captured or able to avail of services.
They're not, they're off the grid. So you have chronic homeless, which tends to be internationally and even in Ireland is defined as being homeless for more than 6 months. Mm-hmm. Then episodic, that's where you come in cycles. So you've been in, you leave, and you also have couch surfing, which is precarious. I'm sure plenty of people have done it in the past. Yes. But people can exit of their own resources. But what we tend to find, particularly in my experience amongst the LGBTI community, is they will access that resource in terms of going to friends, parents, things like that. Younger people tend to do that also. But eventually that'll wane out and then they'll have to enter the system. Very, very interestingly, females enter homelessness later than males. Females are far more resilient and are far more able to call on resources than males for some reason. There has been research in Ireland specifically around this.
So can I ask you, in terms of those options for people that are presenting as homelessness, what are the options for people that are at risk of homelessness in Ireland today?
So in terms of if someone is at risk of homelessness, so they're not homeless yet, one of the first things to do would be to find out what type of accommodation are they in. Is it local authority, private rented, or owned, mortgaged? If it's local authority and they're at risk of homelessness, people can contact, there is a social work department in every council in Ireland, and their job specifically is to prevent homelessness. So you can contact them. People don't realize that there are social workers in the councils. They think they only belong to TUSLA. So the other thing is, if they're in private rented accommodation and there's a risk of being homeless, two options. One is the Residential Tenancies Board. You can refer to them and get onto them quite quickly. They can begin proceedings against a landlord if there's cause. The other one is you can contact Threshold. Now, I will send you on these details rather than putting them up on a slide.
Sure.
They have a prevention service and they will start to work with someone. The key thing here is, and in our experience, people tend to ring us if they've been issued a notice of termination, or that's the new term for it. It used to be called a notice to quit. They used to ring us the day before or the day of. at which point it is way too late down the track. You want to get in earlier. And that's human nature to, I'll get this fixed or to avoid. But there are options. There's also in the Dublin area, the 4 local authorities each have a service that is dedicated at prevention, because we realize get in quicker.
And of course,
outside of that, Louth has a service, Cavan has a service, Monaghan has a service. Galway do, but it's not as defined. Cork also has a service, and Limerick. So there are national services to deal with this. If a person becomes homeless, the first thing, obviously, if they're in dire need of emergency accommodation, they have to be accepted. So what will happen is, and we'll use Dublin as the example here, there is a thing called the free phone. So basically it's a telephone line, and you will be given a bed for a night. And that will be in a large congregate setting of a hostel. There is no hostels in Dublin that are small. They predominantly are 20 beds and above, right up to the 100 mark. They are in shared rooms. I'm one of the few places that actually has individual rooms in terms of a hostel. Then what needs to happen is they'll have to present to Dublin City Council, and a determination will have to be made. Now, when you start to think about this, they will have to bring PPS number, photo ID. They'll even have to go to the tax office. So there's things, the system in itself is quite cumbersome in terms of, because once you get registered homeless, you have to be put onto the housing list. So there's a whole process. If you are not from the area, and this is very important, so if you become homeless in Dublin and you're not from Dublin, you will not be granted, in terms of the local authority, ongoing emergency accommodation, in terms of, we'll give you a week in there. You work on a night-by-night basis. You'll be asked to return to your area of origin, because you have to prove what's called a local connection. And that is becoming more difficult. But that is because we would have a lot, and particularly when it comes to the gay community, we tend to congregate in cities. The red lights of the city bring us in. I'm not referring to the red light zone. I'm referring to, sorry, the bright lights even of the city. So we tend to congregate in cities. So if you're from Cork, you'll be told, back you go. And that's the system. For right or for wrong, that is the system. And it's an economic reason why this has occurred, because obviously Dublin can't be expected to solve the rest of the country's homelessness, as much as other local authorities will send people to Dublin.
That's a really great point, is that, you know, if you're not sort of acceptable in this sort of bureaucratic system that we seem to have with local authorities, it's really great that there are voluntary services out there like Focus Ireland, Chrysalis and others who take on people's cases, you know, and provide advice and information, and can maybe wiggle around a little bit in terms of services that local authorities would not be able to provide. So that,
and we can also fast track you maybe to, if you do have to go back to your area of origin, we'll tend to know what services are available. And then it's the other things when you do become homeless, it's what your basic needs. Like you wouldn't think this, but I've experienced people who sleep in their cars, but they'll come into one of my services to have a shower to go to work. They'll come in, they'll bring their own breakfast, they'll go to the gym. You know, that's what I'm saying. Get the image of a rough sleeper sitting at O'Connell Bridge out of your head, because that's a small proportion of homelessness. And I'm sure there's people here today that possibly may have been affected by this as well. So being homeless has a lot of stigma attached to it and a lot of shame. So if you're coming out as LGBTI, there's stigma and shame there. You're homeless, there's stigma and shame there. You put the two together and you've got pretty much of a minefield. And you possibly have mental health issues as well. So, and the research actually that we've done brought this out very, very, very well. And it's known as the double closet. People don't like telling that they've got mental health issues, and then they don't like to, when they're coming in to services, they don't want to say that they're gay or straight. So they're continually closeting themselves. And another key thing around this is it's about visibility. Now, in all services I manage, we would have the pride flag, etc. Colette has done training with us as well. We use the stickers. So that in itself is just enough to say, hey up, there's a crowd of ones in there, they might be half all right. It's just about creating a welcoming space. That's what we try to do.
And so we think about also even people that are housed, when we talk about direct provision, they're by law, in terms of the bureaucratic system, we have housed, albeit temporarily and in a very congregated setting. So that double closet of being both in the direct provision system, but also being an LGBTI person in the direct provision system, would you encounter many people who are homeless or would consider themselves homeless coming from a direct provision system that are LGBT? Would you consider that a double closet?
Absolutely. Something, and people find this very difficult to either understand or accept. Exclusion begets exclusion. So there's a hierarchy of exclusion. So if you're, and there's theory to back this up, but what you tend to do is think about it as a human being, think about it here as a group of people ourselves. If you see someone who's different from you, you will either, traditionally speaking, you will not want to associate, and you'll associate with the in crowd. So then if you go into homeless services and you notice someone who's more vulnerable than you, or someone who has come out as gay, you'll target them. So whether you're gay yourself or not, it's irrelevant. You will actually target someone else to take the light off you. That is very, very dominant within homeless services. So Joanne will know this as well. Within the people who use drugs, you'll often hear them saying, I'm not on the needle, I'm no junkie. But they could be smoking 5 bags of heroin a day. And you're going, what's the difference between you smoking 5 bags of heroin and Mick over there injecting 5 bags of heroin? There is a hierarchy which reinforces the exclusionary nature. And that message is very clear, that people will, so they stay in the closet. Now, this is a very sad thing to actually say to someone who's on the journey to coming out and they come into homeless services. I've often had to say to them, you might want to pause that. And it's a very difficult thing to say, because you doing that, you don't have the support mechanisms, you don't have the support systems within the hostel environment. And it can be quite unsafe. And people might don't necessarily appreciate that.
Yes.
So that personal journey of someone coming, I'm ready to come out, and I'll always remember 10 years ago having to say to a youngster, you may get back into that closet as quick as you come out, because I knew where they were staying and I knew the environment.
Yes.
And unfortunately, they were sexually assaulted afterwards. Now, when they disclosed that, we were able to access the guide clinic in James's, but that was it. That person shut down.
That's a tough call to have to make.
And some people, and I certainly know in the gay community, I have heard people say we have to celebrate coming out and things like that. And from a psychology perspective, I'd be looking at going, sometimes that journey needs to be tempered. Yeah, it's about safety, and it's a very sad thing.
So let's talk about I'm really struck by how much of a judgment call somebody has to make on that on a daily basis, and to have somebody, a professional, have to say to them, look, there are other priorities here, because the whole personal journey of coming out is hard earned for people. So, and when that's mixed with homelessness, it becomes even more nuanced. So let's talk about the needs of people who are experiencing addiction. I think that's kind of a really relevant point. And we'll bring in Joanne.
So just hitting on what Paul said there about young people within the community and being within the homeless services and coming out. I've experienced that myself, and telling people to kind of, and it's awful, because I'm a very open-minded person myself, and to have to tell people, mind yourself and tone it down a little bit, because you're in an environment where not everybody will be as accepting.
Yes.
And that in itself, the social stigma that comes with it, and it comes, and they've had that through all their life. And a lot of the time, it's even, I suppose, thinking of the LGBT community, even coming to terms with their own sexuality can be a huge thing. I've worked with many people. I've worked in the homeless services, and I am specifically addiction, but I have worked in the homeless services, so I do understand what Paul is talking about. I've worked with people who have slept rough through fear of staying in hostels from the LGBT community, and slept rough a number of years. And again, use drugs to suppress, I suppose, the dual diagnosis, to self-medication of themselves throughout the years. The social stigma, I mean, it is getting so much better. And I think the communities are really opening up to the LGBT community, and we're getting an awful lot more knowledge, and it's amazing and it's great. But again, I was listening to the lady earlier on, the lady that was speaking on intersex, and she was talking about how different it is in hospitals and the Catholic Church having a handle on that. I've actually experienced that firsthand. I'm a mother of a lesbian girl, and she suffered extremely bad with her mental health. At the age of 16, she came out to me quite young because I'm a very open person. And when I took her to see a mental health team, it was horrific. It was horrific how he spoke to her, how patronizing he was to her, that I actually took her out and paid for privately weekly. It was just, it blew me away. But I suppose getting back to Chrysalis and what we're about.
You're saying, Joanne, that kind of with the people that you've worked with have presented it with different kind of dual diagnosis, varied diagnosis, and that 90% of LGBT people struggle with their mental health. So that's quite a significant number of people that you work with. It
is, and it just, I suppose, over the last, say, 10 years, when people are getting a little bit more confident about talking about it, well, I wouldn't say confident, but, you know, slowly unraveling, and when you get to know someone as a case manager, it can take time to build that relationship. And I suppose I've had many different extremes. I've had a lady who came from the traveling community, and she was in fear of going into the hostels because there was so many traveling community in the hostels. And because she had presented as a gay woman, she was even in fear because she had been given a horrific attack by her own family, that she was left with physical impairments for the rest of her life. That woman is now dead. She slept rough for a number of years, self-harmed, dual diagnosis. The mental health services just weren't there to support her. There wasn't enough appointments. There wasn't enough understanding of it. And quite ignorantly myself at that time. And that's when I started to try and educate myself a little bit more around it and understanding around it. I do think services are slightly changing. Well, community services, without a doubt. I'm talking about HSC services. I do think they're slightly changing. But I do think, you know, Paul spoke about it there with the CPS. I had a young lad who presented to the service, no drug or alcohol issues, but extremely distressed. And obviously I wasn't going to turn him away from the service. He was a young gay man. He had told his father had put him out, and he was terrified of going into the homeless services. So I rang the CPS, the Central Placement Service. I explained the situation, specifically asking for a room on his own because he was very distressed. And, you know, without putting a label on people, he was quite camp. So it was quite obvious, you know, and I was fearful for him myself, going into a hostel where there can be shared rooms. And he was very distressed on this particular day. They couldn't accommodate. They couldn't accommodate. Yeah. He hadn't told anybody else, friends, distant family members, and he felt he'd no one to turn to. And as, I suppose, a professional myself, I felt quite hopeless. So I could only imagine how he felt.
Yes. And as a case worker, Joanne, you've mentioned, you know, kind of in your presentation today around, you know, coming into services where maybe you haven't touched drugs or drink ever in your life, and then you go into these services, and you know that they're there at the drop of a hand. You can, you can start as you start exploring your sexuality, your own sexual behavior, you know, you come into contact perhaps with different types of drugs and different experiences. Can you give us a sense of the, so maybe some of the drugs or some of the kind of risky sexual behavior that some of your clients might experience as they go through homelessness?
I had one particular gentleman I worked with, and I worked with him for a number of years. He presented as a heterosexual male in a relationship with a child. He eventually, his drug use was so extreme at that time, they became homeless. The relationship broke down. She went back to family members, and eventually he got recovery. And this lasted really well for 3 years. And I moved services. And last August, I came up against this man again in a clinic that I do an in-reach clinic in. He was extremely dependent again. He was a very different man, extreme dual diagnosis. It was mind blowing to see the change in him. So anyway, I started working with him again, and when the relationship had built up again, he eventually explained to me that he had always thought he was gay. And he had started exploring in, you know, the gay community. And not having much knowledge around that and trying to keep everything, he ended up at a party, which again, I wouldn't be hugely knowledgeable around, but he explained it as what he called a daddy party, right? He went to the party, there was many substance there, but he hadn't taken any yet because it was his first experience.
Yes.
And the next thing he remembers is waking up in a sauna room, tied up with extreme damage to his rectum, choke marks, being tied up. He was 2.5 hours before he was untied. And it just blew me away. I didn't think these sorts of things went on. It blew me away. And again, when he went to the hospital, he felt it was so clinical and cold, the questions.
Yes.
And he couldn't deal with it. And he just ended up full blown back on heroin, crack, every drug, extreme mental health from the trauma he had experienced. Doesn't trust the gay community anymore. It was hugely
experience of sort of exploring your sexuality for your client, having first time sexual experiences, mixing that with first time experience perhaps of drug use, and then I suppose the detrimental effects and the trauma that can be left behind from those kinds of experiences must be very difficult.
Can I just come in on that, because there's 3 big elements there as well that it's always worth remembering. The gay scene, particularly globally, but you take Ireland. So a young person coming out, or a young person, I'll take myself. So my first experience of the gay scene was a pub. So it's very important to note where is it safe for people to come out, or not even come out, find your other family. And traditionally it's a pub. So you start going into pubs young enough, and there's drink. So then you want to meet more people again. So I find the family and you feel comfortable. You're going, this is fun. You could end up going there 5, 6, 7 nights a week. And this might resonate with people or not. The next thing then is, so there's drink associated with that. You can actually you can fall into addiction that way, because now you're going out and you're associating. The gay scene has traditionally, amongst drug dealers particularly, well known as being not party central, but the place to experiment and test new product. So if you break it down into drug dealers been quite clever marketeers. They're going, right, we have a new product, where do we go? Because being gay and happy is being liberal and partying. That's, I would say, an illusion that has been built up over the years around the gay community. And that indirectly links into what Joanne's talking about, where a fella fell into it in a very bad way. In terms of chemsex, on the bright side, Ireland has a low enough level of chemsex, but it is very present, and actually more present in the country areas, from what I can hear of young people coming up into homeless services, and more dominant among 35 plus. So it's not a young person's game. So it's very interesting. If you take your own journey of coming out, and whether that's going to the George or the old Front Lounge or a few other places that are now closed from many years ago, it is always associated around drink and alcohol, and the gay community have never fully opened up or decided to address their issues around the relationship of being gay and alcohol in Ireland.
I think we might talk about that in our breakout rooms now, because
I think it's
I really want to give us time. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions for both yourself, Paul, and Joanne in relation to that. So we might move now quickly into our breakout rooms for 10 or 15 minutes to have a conversation with one another about that. Maybe that journey of being gay and you know, your first experience in a pub, and it's all fun and great crack, and how that might escalate into maybe deeper, more nuanced issues for people as well. So we might do that now. So will our tech guys sort out our breakout rooms if you'd like to join now? Great. So we have about 15 minutes, everyone, for our questions and answers session with Paul and Joanne. So the questions that we have so far, they've been populated in the chat there. If there are any questions that you have, we may not be able to get to them all, but I'll certainly try and get to as many as I can. So one of the first questions that we got, which I think is, Paul, might be addressed towards you and your experience with kind of emergency accommodation, is there any safe hostels for LGBTI plus people? And if there are, how might we refer to them when we think about people who might be calling the helpline?
No, there is no, in terms of defining a safe LGBTI hostel, basically there is none. There's no, it doesn't need elaboration. They don't exist.
Can I ask, Paul, just on that, and it was one of my questions I put forward, would it be something that you would look at down the line of maybe restructuring where there is safer elements? So I'll give you an example of a transgender I was working with in a hostel when I worked for Crosscare. We did facilitate a room for him because he was going through the change at that particular time. And I just want to know, would Focus Ireland look at restructuring to have safer places for people to go to?
So there's two elements there. So the first thing is we don't have the capacity to do that. That lies in Dublin. That is the remit of the Department of the Environment and the Homeless Executive. We can't restructure the system. Now, within accessing services, I've had referrals in for couples and things, and also people who are pre-op and post-op, and I've been able to accommodate them in the place I manage. But the wider system needs to be changed. So one of the things that I knew that was going to come out of the research is that we would need a dedicated LGBTI facility, but that will not go down well, as it is diametrically opposed to the policy position of successive governments in Ireland, that they do not want specialist facilities. They want people in and out of homelessness. And yet all the research globally says you need dedicated queer spaces. You need a dedicated queer emergency accommodation. London, or I think it's in London, they even have a bus, which is brilliant. When you're in a crisis, you can get innovative, and they have a queer bus that provides emergency accommodation and goes around. So it's a structural issue more, Joanne. You could actually do it in mainstream hostels if they provided single rooms. Yeah. But at the moment, very few have double rooms. Most of them are four bed and 6 bed. Sounds all very salubrious, and don't think of a hostel as a youth hostel. These are just rooms with bunk beds. End of story. Some of them don't even have doors on them. They just have a curtain. So there's no privacy. And then you have the difficulty as well, Joanne, of when you ring the CPS, the Central Placement Service, when you ring their phone line, male, female, there is no third option. We've made a recommendation that there needs to be a third option. And if someone is within the spectrum of transgender, how they identify, if it's on their birth cert that they're female and they're identifying as male, they'll be sent to a female-only hostel. There's very few mixed hostels as well in Dublin. You'll get couples in the traditional sense, obviously, they use the binary of male, female. There is a couple of couples hostels. They rarely, any gay couples I know, they're in tents in places like out on the beach, Malahide, places like that. And sometimes that's where we'll tell them to go. We'll say, get a tent and go. That's what you need to do. Because you have to think safety first. It's a structural issue more so than anything else.
It definitely is. I remember back in 2010 or 2011, they had a huge conference. The councils came together to look at the restructure. You probably remember this, Paul, to look at the restructure. And I thought this was going to change everything.
Oh, God.
Things were actually better before it than after.
We were better, yes.
I think so.
This would be my personal take on it. The government of the time very much adopted until recently an out of sight, out of mind policy. So we had a massive explosion in large facilities opening up overnight at the drop of a hat. And these are large empty warehouses that literally might have 50, 60-foot ceilings in them, or roofs, but they literally walked in, partitioned up about 20 foot, and they're just like, we are warehousing human beings.
Yeah.
I walked into one of them, and the overwhelming sense I got was, this is like a cattle mart. It reminded me of a cattle mart.
I know that you're
back home.
And echoed everywhere.
Yes.
It was just unreal. It actually reminded me of a prison.
And no, well, see, I got the march sense because I'm a country boy. So, literally, it was like walking down to the local mart, looking into pens and saying, sure, we'll buy that heifer there. There's a couple of bullocks down in the back paddock or the back one. So it's the value in, a lot of this is about even the value we put on people. People are being warehoused, and that is the only description that I could ever think of it. But unfortunately, going back to the original, systemically, our system is not geared up for it. Hopefully, the conversation is beginning. Hopefully, that will bring it into a sense of awareness. Very much what Stephen is talking about here today, that people at this today's gathering will get a sense of awareness that homelessness is a bigger issue than we realize. And the system, you see, the system is like a brick wall. Sometimes it's to stop you getting in. The problem is when you get into it, the system also stops you getting out.
Yeah.
So the system is quite a contained box. So the experiencing of homelessness can be a rather long journey.
Oh.
I just ask in terms of Joanne, can I just ask you in terms of people that might contact our helpline who are facing either homelessness, but primarily addiction-related issues? What advice, a question from one of our participants is, what advice would you give somebody who might be struggling with addiction, who has called our helpline or sent us a chat on a Friday evening, who maybe might be struggling in their addiction? What advice would you give as a caseworker, Joanne?
Well, I mean, it depends on where they're struggling with addiction. Some people, could be a come down and they're just, they're feeling quite depressed on that particular day. Are they ready to give up drugs yet? Sometimes not. So we're a harm reduction service, and I don't believe one shoe fits all. So I would assess the person. I would ask them where they would like to see themselves in 12 months. Some people aren't ready to give up certain drugs, but I would look at the sort of drugs they're using. I would give them advice and support around the different specific drug. If they're intravenous drug users, I'd give them the advice and support of where they can get clean needle exchanges. If they do want to access treatment, this is the difficult part. I mean, the waiting lists for treatment is horrific. Also, yes, the loophole to get into treatment. So I have someone who's extremely chaotic, wants to get drug free, but they have to go through a process. So they have to go to stabilization first to get off street drugs. When they get off street drugs, so that sometimes can take up to 12 months to get them into stabilization.
Yes.
Then they go in there, and then you start a process with them of trying to get them into detox off their prescription medication. And then there's actual treatments to work on the psychosocial side of it, you know, so they don't relapse, and relapse prevention. So sometimes the journey can take anything between 12 months to 2 years, probably even 3 years. Some people just want to stabilize. When it comes to the LGBT community, there can be drugs that they use, you know, and one that I'm coming up against quite a lot at the minute, I'm sure you've heard, is G. And this blows me away, because the only way that they can treat G is to prescribe them benzodiazepines, which then gives them a taste for a new drug.
Yeah.
And it blows me mind, the health system. And G is quite a strong drug on the nervous system that has to be used. It has to, like, I've worked with someone who OD'd on it. And if he hadn't have been prescribed benzodiazepines, you know, his system, his brain would have fried. He was seizing, and there was a lot of seizures there. But I find the system mind-boggling, and I learn something new every single day in this field. G is relatively new to me. I've only come across it in the last 14 months. I know it's out there a long time. But it you know, the system needs to change, but we could be talking about that all day.
And I think the other two drugs that that when you think LGBTI and not necessarily chemsex, but is ketamine and crystal.
Yeah.
For anybody who may have heard of Grindr, there has been a rapid increase on profiles with crystals. Now, some people think it's selling sex. It's also selling the drug crystal, and then H and H, which is horny and high, or high and horny, depending on what people want to call it. So there are chemsex parties going on. So it's sex. So it's risky sexual behavior with drugs, and getting the latest high using that.
So if we have people that present then sort of on our helpline or on our chat who have mental health issues around sexual behavior, drugs, alcohol, and homelessness, there are long, you know, there's systemic and societal issues, long waiting lists. So for people who might be presenting with mental health, homelessness, drugs and addiction, where would you suggest a volunteer would refer? What would be your top recommendation for a volunteer to refer to a service where they might get the help that they need?
Well, as a case manager, I look at all areas of people's lives. So and I would pull a case conference with many different services, psychiatrists, and at the minute Chrysalis has just got a dual diagnosis psychiatrist, which is the first time ever to happen in a community service, which is brilliant. We only have them for a couple of hours a week, but it's great because we don't have to go through the GP, the mental health services, miss an appointment, knocked off. This man is actually working with us on a weekly basis with our dual diagnosis clients. You know, whether it's homelessness, every area, criminality, homelessness, probation, Tulsa, addiction, Chrysalis would be the service. And our team has grown hugely over the last 12 months. We're also working with methadone clinics now, and we have in-reach clinics within methadone clinics, which again is the first time in ever, I think, that they've allowed the psychosocial side to go into a methadone clinic. So it is slightly changing, but yeah, I would say case management would be a case management service. Chrysalis, I have it in the slideshow so you can pass it on to the volunteers. We have two different services now, Dublin 1 and Dublin 7. We have the Social Inclusion Hub, which we work very closely with the Safety Net team. We have a needle exchange, we have occupational therapists, physiotherapists, psychiatrists. We've doctors on hand. 5 days a week, which is brilliant. And that team now has grown from, originally started with just myself and another case manager last August, and we now have 10 case managers down there. I am now going back to the Chrysalis building.
Great service provision there, Joanne.
I'm now going back to the service in Dublin 7. But remember, if they're homeless, they don't reach a catchment area.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter what hostel they're in any part of Dublin, they can come to us because homeless doesn't reach a catchment area.
And I think the other thing there as well is just in terms of what you were saying. So if someone rings up the helpline, my inclination would be to probably ask them what is the most important thing for them right now. Because one of the things, and Joanne will know this as well, getting their drug might be far, far more important than addressing their homelessness. So it's around safety and containment. And that first, because getting them to the point of, they could be ringing up saying, yeah, I'm drug using, or I'm homeless, and they could be in South Monaghan. So it'll be a case of, okay, well, what to you right now, what's the most important thing? And you'd be quite surprised, they could turn around and say, getting my next fix is far more important than getting my accommodation. So it's using that system of harm reduction, consistently reducing harm to themselves and keeping them safe. So if you go back to the experience Joanne had there of the gentleman who was in a relationship and then started to explore their sexuality. So he was involved in a whole scenario, possibly that involved slamming. So there's a whole thing around possibly having to educate people. Now that's not the remit of the helpline. I totally get that, but there's a whole. But it's important to have the language of going. In Ireland, we haven't got to the point yet in chemsex where what's happening in London is they're handing out slamming kits. So that's where the syringe only has a maximum of 1 ml. So that just ensures safety when someone is slamming G into them. And slamming is just IV use. And people are dying from it.
Mm-hmm.
Then let's not kid ourselves.
Yeah.
They are absolutely dying from this.
I just say, folks, we're at, it's such a rich conversation today, and thank you both to Paul and Joanne. You know, this is a topic that we could do a whole series on, isn't it? But I really appreciate that there are specialist services out there, both with Chrysalis, case management and key working, and also with Focus Ireland in terms of advice and information, and the free phone number that people can refer to. So we're at 3 minutes past 1, and I'm conscious that we'd all like a break. But before we go on our break, I'd just like to say thank you to Paul and Joanne, and thank you to the volunteers for listening. You know, we've touched on a lot of topics in our conversation today around drug use, homelessness, sexual assault in quite graphic detail perhaps as well. So if you are being triggered or affected by this, please know that we're here for you. We've posted a message in the chat from our CEO that if you do need to reach out at all to us during the lunch break, there's a number there that you can reach out to if you need to speak with us, because it is quite a lot to take in today in one afternoon. So know that we are here, and thank you for sharing your difficulties that you've experienced in the conversations today. I'm really taking away a lot and quite triggered by some of the things that were talked about today that I didn't know existed out there. So thank you for bringing that into our awareness.
And thanks so much for having me, Stephen.
Yes, thank you very much.
We'll
and if people have more questions, if you want to email them to us, I'm sure Joanne will be able to answer them, and maybe put a frequently asked questions thing together.
100%.
Yes, and we'll make the PowerPoints available after this, and this session is being recorded, so we'll be able to consult that later on. So look, we'll go for our lunch break. It's well earned, and we'll be back for the next session at 2 o'clock. So please do enjoy your lunch break.